if we think of tissues as like a bridge, like a tendon's a bridge connecting a muscle to a bone. If you have a bridge that is falling apart, do you stretch the bridge out and make it longer? Or do you pour more concrete and add more pillars and lines to that bridge? Like, we want a stronger, more robust bridge. So most of my interventions tend to focus more on making that tissue that's injured get stronger again.
Today's episode is with Dr. Zachary Long. Dr. Zach is a physical therapist in Charlotte, North Carolina, and runs an industry-leading fitness website called the Barbell Physio, where he is a trusted resource to thousands of athletes, coaches, and healthcare professionals across the world. So in today's episode, Dr. Zach is bringing us through some of the most common mistakes people make when it comes to injury rehab. And more specifically, he explains the reasoning behind why resting is often the worst thing you can do when injured and what you should do instead. We also chat about the benefits of using modalities such as lifting shoes or heel elevation, wrist straps, and weight belts. And we dive into the misinformation surrounding squat depth and why squatting with your knees over your toes isn't inherently bad. And we also chat about why and how CrossFit training can lead to muscle or hypertrophy gains. So this episode is packed with tons of great info from Dr. Zach, and I know you're going to take a lot of practical tips away. So let's get into it. All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I'm here with Dr. Zach Long. What's up, Zach? How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. So we're going to be chatting about a few different topics today, diving into injuries, diving into some mistakes that some people might be making when it comes to rehab, just kind of going through some of your personal expertise over the years, what you've seen in your own practice and through obviously your own research. But before we get started, do you want to tell our listeners or viewers a little bit about you, how you got into the, physical therapy side of things, how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I'm a physical therapist in North Carolina, but before that, I was able to spend a number of years working in strength and conditioning, and I've just been able to be fortunate to kind of blend those two worlds, where so often strength and conditioning professionals don't know what to do when somebody's hurt, and physical therapists don't know what to do when somebody's past being hurt, but still is not performing the way they want to in the gym anymore. And so I can help kind of bridge the gap between those two areas for people.
Love it. Love it. And so in terms of kind of your personal journey through exercise, are there any particular sports that you have a passion for? I know CrossFit is one of those ones where you work a lot, in. Is there anything else besides CrossFit?
Yeah, CrossFit's my main one, but kind of with a heavy strength bias. Like I love just moving heavy weights like so many CrossFitters do. So I probably don't pay enough attention to the aerobic side of the equation of CrossFit as I should, because I'm a meathead at heart that kind of found CrossFit.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So the first topic I want to talk about is when it comes to rest and injuries. So I personally went to undergrad for athletic training. So I have an athletic training background. And one of the things that I learned through schooling years ago was rest was like the first thing that you do when you get injured, right? And there was actually a quote that I came across on your content on your Instagram, and you said, rest is often the worst thing you can do when you get injured.
Yeah.
So can we chat a little bit about that? And, if rest is, like you said, often the worst thing we can do, what should we be doing instead? And what should we be focusing on instead when we get when we get an injury?
Yeah. So you probably saw this a million times in the athletic training world. Somebody twists an ankle. We have them rest completely for a period of time. They get back to it. And what happens next? They tweak something else. So we have to appreciate that when we're training for sport, we're building tissue fitness. We're not just building your aerobic conditioning or your muscle size or strength, but we're building tendon strength, ligament strength. All these different tissues are getting more robust. And when somebody has an injury to one area and we just completely stop training and go to complete rest, we're doing that to try to help this injured tissue heal up. But if we go to complete rest, we do that at the expense of losing all of that fitness that we've gained. Again, fitness isn't just being fit, it's tissues being strong to resist injury. So we need to, when somebody is injured, try to maintain as much of that fitness as possible, both in the injured tissue as well as in the tissues around it. So that's something that I'm working really hard to just try to convince more doctors, physical therapists, et cetera, to understand that we can make modifications to people's training that doesn't delay the healing process, that in fact would probably speed up the healing process, but that also will maintain as much fitness as possible. So we're not digging as deep of a hole in somebody in terms of their sport preparedness when they're injured. So we want to maintain as much tissue fitness as possible. Then we also have to understand, like, when a tissue's hurt, we are dealing with mechanical breakdown of a tissue. So like, let's say you sprain your ankle. When you sprain an ankle, that means that the ligament on the side of your ankle, or one of the ligaments, actually becomes torn in some amount. That could be a complete tear, that could be a partial tear, that could just be an overstretching, but there has been actual damage to that tissue. But in addition to that actual damage, we also have a bunch of inflammation hanging around there. And that inflammation and mechanical damage both produce pain effects in our body. Mm-hmm. If we have inflammation sitting in an area and we pump a bunch of blood in there, a bunch of fluid, and then our body pumps that stuff out, what's going to happen to that inflammation? We're going to help to start get rid of some of that. And so by staying active when we're dealing with an injury, we're going to also help with a pain relieving effect and removing inflammation effect so that things have the potential to heal faster. Now, it's not just though, all right, you tweaked your knee, I don't care, we're going to go do some heavy ass to the grass squats and just deal with the pain. Like, we have to respect that tissues are healing, but we need to find ways to be significantly better at doing all the stuff that we just talked about.
Okay. Awesome. So in terms of like some other modifications besides obviously just not resting it right away, are there other modifications that you would pay attention to? Obviously, this is going to be dependent on the specific injury at hand, but just in general, are there any specific things that you tend to focus on?
Yeah, a lot of different tactics we could use here. So to start with, we could adjust the variation of exercise we're using. Like, let's say your hip hurts. A back squat tends to use more hip mobility than a front squat. And so an easy substitution, if you have hip pain, it might be to just swap to a barbell or front squat rather. Little modifications like that are going from a barbell overhead press to a dumbbell overhead press where you can change the angle that you're pressing. Those can significantly change what we're experiencing from a pain perspective. We could limit the range of motion. Maybe you're not tolerating the pull off the ground of the deadlift. So we raise the bar up on a 12-inch box. We just limit the range of motion. We're still training the same movement pattern, still moving heavy loads. Maybe we are lightening the load, but going for more volume. So let's say you can squat and squats feel fine, but when you get to a certain weight, it bothers you. So let's stay below that load and let's just train more volume there for that. So we're still going to get an adaptive response by our body, still train the same movement pattern, but not put that load that starts to become aggravating. And we could take that, as far away as, let's say somebody just had like a knee surgery and they can't do anything at all on that leg. Then let's train the other leg, the one that's not injured, because some research has shown that when we train the uninjured side, our injured side actually loses less strength and loses less muscle mass. So we can get it's called a crossover effect from that. So just a number of different things. Our goal should always be to just what's the maximal amount of, or closest, how close can we be to our intended stimulus of a workout without slowing down the healing process. And when we do that, we're going to be significantly better off long-term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely the uninjured side, training the uninjured side versus the injured side. That's definitely research that I've come across, throughout the years, and
yeah, it's weird
use that myself
stuff
as well. Yeah. Are there any, like, in terms of other mistakes that you've seen? I know, like when I was going through school, the biggest, and we kind of alluded to this already, but one of the biggest things that we learned in athletic training was RICE, like rest, ice, compression, elevation. So is there any validity to RICE? Like, now that you've kind of gone through your own practice throughout the years, is it something that you still would utilize? Is it, would you not? Obviously the rest part we just talked about, but the other factors like ice, compression.
Yeah, so that from the ice perspective, like I'll still use ice if we need to numb an area up. Like I sprained my ankle 6 months ago, pretty nasty. And that night I iced it. And I didn't ice it from an anti-inflammation standpoint. I iced it because it hurt pretty good. And I just wanted to numb it up for a little while. I think from an anti-inflammation standpoint, if we actively move, we're going to have a significantly better anti-inflammation standpoint than icing. And I actually think that the researcher, and I don't know his name right now, that first came up with the RICE acronym has kind of stepped back from that and says that he no longer really likes that. I will compress some stuff every now and then. You'll see sometimes when you compress a joint or muscle that's really swollen, that you'll see some of that swelling release, and then you can do more active motion. So I'll use that basically as a way for me to do what we just talked about quicker, to get more aggressive on our exercise prescription. And you'll kind of see the same thing with elevation. But really, everything's moved significantly more towards active movement in terms of dealing with an injury rather than RICE.
Got it. And would you say, like, in terms of like on the inflammation side of things, in terms of NSAIDs and like anti-inflammatories, is that something that you recommend? Or I know, like, especially going back to when I was in school, it's like, all right, if you get injured, pop an Aleve or an Advil or whatever it may be. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we have to appreciate that every intervention we do has side effects, whether that's the exercises I just talked about or an NSAID or any other medication. NSAIDs do not come without some significant side effects, and their side effects of those are pretty common. So my preference is to not do that, but I am not a licensed physician, so I don't recommend that anyway because it's outside of my scope. But my personal belief is I'd rather avoid putting anything like that in my body if I have the choice. But there are certainly times where that is appropriate.
Got it. Yeah. I feel like I'm on the same page there in terms of like the external medication, but in terms of like the anti-inflammatory portion of it versus just like the pain relief, is there any benefit to that in certain, like, from what you've seen? Or
Yeah. I mean, there certainly is plenty of research out there that shows that when we use anti-inflammatory medications, we'll see some injuries heal faster. But that's a case by case basis for somebody to discuss with their physician rather than making that decision on their own.
Yeah, for sure. Makes sense. And then another question under this category of, when you get injured, like what should you do or should you not do? And I've had a lot of clients say, like, ask me this question, like, I did this, I already tweaked this, should I stretch it? Can we talk a little bit about like how to know if you should be stretching something versus strengthening something? Because I think that's a huge confusion for a lot of people.
Yeah. So I'm going to say for the most part, my interventions tend to focus on strengthening tissues more than stretching them, but I certainly do utilize both. Most of the time when we're talking about a muscle or a tendon issue, so a muscle strain, a tendon strain, we're looking at that from that tissue was challenged more than it was prepared for. So that tissue became broken down. Let's say you went from running 2 days a week to running 4 days per week, and your body was not prepared for that running volume. And so a couple of weeks into that volume, your Achilles tendon or your patellar tendon starts to bother you. You challenge that tissue more than it was ready for. And so if we think of tissues as like a bridge, like a tendon's a bridge connecting a muscle to a bone. If you have a bridge that is falling apart, do you stretch the bridge out and make it longer? Or do you pour more concrete and add more pillars and lines to that bridge? Like, we want a stronger, more robust bridge. So most of my interventions tend to focus more on making that tissue that's injured get stronger again. So I like to explain it like a bridge or like a bank account. Like if your bank account's running low, what do? You don't stretch it out and spread it across more bank accounts. You go work more and figure out a way to put more money into the bank so that you have more reserve. So I want to build the tissue strength up as much as possible. Now with that, when you're having pain, a lot of times doing certain stretches can help alleviate your pain. So what I encourage people to do from a stretch perspective is do a stretch, find a movement that bothers you. So we call that your asterisk sign. Like, this is what we're going to test and retest. Do a stretch, go back to that thing that bothered you. Did it get better? And maybe didn't go away, but like, did the pain reduce? Did you have more range of motion afterwards? Those sorts of things. And if you find stretches that help, continue to do those. I think most people tend to take a pretty big shotgun approach when they're kind of self-treating stuff. So let's be really scientific with it. Try something, see how your body responds, go back and retest rather than doing 5 different hip stretches and wondering, which one of these made my back feel better, which ones had no effect. Let's narrow that down in terms of the stretching stuff we're doing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. What about foam rolling or like massage therapy? How do you how do you use that in your practice?
Yeah, so any sort of soft tissue work, foam rolling, massage therapy, pulling out like a Theragun, a lacrosse ball, compression banding, all of those things do have really good temporary effects on our movement. Like they can create some pain inhibition, they can create some ability for our joints or muscles to go through more range of motion. But we really have to appreciate that that stuff is really, really short term and temporary. It doesn't create any long term changes in our tissue. So, for example, like the IT band, there was a study that showed that it took, I think it was 2,000 pounds of force to deform the IT band 1%. So, like, you're not going to foam roll your IT band and change anything on that. You might, if you have your spouse drive a truck over your IT band, then you might deform that tissue a little bit, but that's going to create a whole host of other issues. But they do have short-term effects. So like if foam rolling increases your range of motion a little bit, great, do that and then follow it up with some active movement or some loading. If it turns your pain down for a little bit, great, let's utilize that to then let us exercise a little bit more because it's load in challenging tissues that's going to have longer lasting effects on that tissue. Like nobody ever got fitter laying on a massage table and having somebody rub their legs. Like that doesn't change anything about your physiology. It relaxes you. It certainly has some nervous system effects. It may change some pain stuff temporarily, but I believe, and the research is pretty clear, that it takes load, time under tension, active movement to create longer term changes in tissues, which is what we ultimately all want to happen. So utilize those things for the short term benefits that they can give.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when I was back in school and I worked as a athletic trainer in grad school, and when we were in the training room, a lot of the machines we utilized were like the tens unit machines, like the stim we called it, and like ultrasound and things like that. Obviously, alongside like massage therapy, Theraguns, those things. So my last question here, in terms of like the stim, would you categorize those in the same kind of place in terms of pain relief, and or is there more to like a stim machine or like ultrasound therapy?
I don't utilize either of those.
Okay.
So TEN stands for transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. Think of it as if somebody punched you in the arm, like your instinct would be, besides maybe wanting to punch them back, but your instinct would be to like rub your arm where they hit you, because the sensation of touch kind of overrides some of that your brain's perception of the pain a little bit. That's what TENS does. It sends a little electrical signal across your skin. I'm really dumbing this down, but it creates a temporary pain relief effect, but it doesn't do anything long-term to your tissues. In terms of something like ultrasound, like in 1987, a systematic review came out that basically said that ultrasound doesn't do anything for soft tissue injuries. So in 1987, a pretty high level of research said we don't need to do it. And we're now sitting here at, oh crap, I was born in 87. We're now sitting here 33 years later, and it's still fairly prevalent in the sports world. So that's a modality that probably needs to die. If you're really hurt and like you really tweak your back or your leg or whatever, you want to throw TENS on there and calm it down. To me, that's just like ice. Like, great, let's use that so that you're not hurting so much right now, but let's appreciate that it's not doing anything to heal you up any faster. And we'll figure out what we need to do to actually accomplish that long-term goal that we care about more.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of those modalities can be useful, but they're mostly just kind of putting a Band-Aid on something for like, just to kind of take the pain.
They're giant placebo effects. Now the placebo effect is strong as crap. Like you've probably seen 100 kids in the athletic training room that you ultrasounded that knee and they jump up and start running around and they feel like they're brand new. My favorite thing, funniest thing I think I've ever seen in the athletic training world was like kids getting cramps on the sideline of a football game, and they get like a mustard packet. And as soon as they have the mustard packet, their cramp is gone. I'm like, well, your body didn't like digest all of that mustard and instantly put it through your bloodstream. Like you had a little bit of placebo effect from that little mustard shot you took.
Yeah, definitely lots of placebo effects going on in the training room for sure. But yeah,
placebo
awesome.
effect's cool. It works
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes, for sure. Cool. Okay. So I want to switch gears a little bit to a different topic. So in terms of when it comes to like limiting factors in training, so I kind of refer to this as when you're training to specifically, for example, like build muscle or hypertrophy or whatever it may be. So I know for me particularly, I have absolute horrible ankle mobility, just from probably some genetics, also lots of sprained ankles in the past that were not, properly taken care of when I was a kid. And so my ankle mobility has always been crappy. And I've, gone through periods where I try to work on making it better. And I see a little bit relief, but then I tend to always kind of come back to where it's at if I stop paying attention to that side of things. So I guess my kind of long-winded way of asking you this question is in terms of kind of using external mechanisms to help us progress in our training. For example, using, lifting shoes or like wedges when we're squatting. What's your view on that, specifically with like the ankle mobility side of things?
So, I mean, if you look at any sport, every sport utilizes tools that help them out from a performance standpoint. There's a reason why when you play football, you don't run around barefoot. You wear cleats. It gives you a better grip on the ground so that you can run better through grass. Same thing if you're a track and field athlete, you wear track spikes. Every sport utilizes different tools to help them out from a performance standpoint. It's a little different in the gym when we're talking about it from a compensation standpoint. Like, your ankles are stiff. Do you want to elevate your heels to try to make up for that? And then people start to have issues with it and say, no, we shouldn't compensate for that stuff. And I couldn't disagree more. Like, if putting something on your body, some sort of external thing that doesn't do work for you, but helps you get into better positions biomechanically, if we have something that we can do to use that does that, like, I'm going to pull that lever all day long. I'm going to elevate your heels. Anything like that I can do, with the understanding that on the side of that, like if I'm having to elevate your heels every time you squat, we need to do some work on the side. But we shouldn't only stick to like quarter rep squats just because your ankles are stiff and say that, well, no, that's not what your body's supposed to do. We can't use these external devices. I think what we'll also see long term is if we're using an assist like that and we're teaching your body what good positioning is like. When your heels are elevated and you can drive your knees further forward in the squat, you can squat to better depth. As we open up your ankle mobility, your body knows where biomechanically it's most efficient. So I think as that motion becomes actually like naturally available, you're going to more easily incorporate that into good technique and good positioning for yourself long term. So I think we're going to be better off when we use that compensation and then combine it with the right accessory stuff to try to open up that range of motion.
I love that. I love that answer. I think that makes complete sense. It's something that I struggle with for years because I was, at some point told, no, you shouldn't be using these things because you're, like you said, compensating or adding, this external thing that, doesn't help you to get, better at ankle mobility. Whereas I'm just trying to get better at squatting and I already have crap ankle mobility. So I'm going to try to do what I can. Well,
if your heels are elevated too, and you're squatting and pushing your knees forward, you're probably still getting to your ankles in range of motion, just like if you didn't have it, but you're getting to that in range of motion while now taking your knee and hip through more range of motion too, so that they get a better training effect. So the same thing's happening at the ankle at the end. We're just training other tissues better.
Yeah, for sure. And while we're on that subject, there's something I want to ask you too about knees over toes with squats and kind of debunking some of the things that we hear when it comes to squatting. Maybe we can do that. Maybe you can just kind of tell us, like, in terms of squats and, having your knees come over your toes. I know back when I was in school, it was like, don't let your knees pass your toes. And, that's going to cause all these issues. Can you kind of chat about why that might not be the case?
Okay. So let's say we're squatting and so I weigh 200 pounds. Let's say I'm a 200-pound individual and I'm squatting 300 pounds on the bar. So 500 pounds of total mass is moving during a squat. Whether my knees go forward or back, this amount of gravity and force happening in my body is the same. If I push my knees forward, I change which joint sees some of those load. If I keep my knees back, I put that force on other loads. So nothing we do in the squat changes up the total sum of force going through the body. It just changes where it goes. which can be a very valuable thing for us to understand. If somebody's dealing with knee pain, maybe we do think of sitting back in the squat, not pushing the knees forward as much, which would then bias the hips and low back more in the squat and spare the knee a little bit, or vice versa. If we want to spare somebody's hips or back a little bit, maybe we push their knees further forward, put a little bit more on the force of the knees, a little less in the back and hips. So we can play that lever either way. What we have to understand mathematically is that when we don't let the knees go past the toes, we decrease the force by 22% on the knee. So what we've always said about the squats, like if the knees go in front of the toes, it puts more force and stress on the knees, is 100% correct. But that force goes to the hips. And the number there is that the force goes up 1000% on the hips. So we're putting significantly more load on the hips to spare a little bit on the knees. So is the juice worth the squeeze there? At times, yes. Most of the time, no. So when I'm talking to athletes about squatting, I literally just say, I want you to sit down. Like I want you to imagine there's a ball or a toilet directly underneath your butt right now. I want you to sit down on that seat. What that's going to result in is their hips are going to go back and their knees are going to go forward. And we're going to spread that load out between both of those tissues. And for most people, I think that's biomechanically going to be their best position. I tend to work a lot more with CrossFit athletes and Olympic lifters, who for them, squatting with an upright torso is a huge performance advantage. So they need to push their knees forward. When they don't push their knees forward, they biomechanically put themselves in a bit of a bind and put serious force on other tissues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then in terms of like, kind of chat about this for a second, but squatting like past parallel, people refer to as ass to grass, right? What are your, because there's a lot of misinformation behind that as well. Like you should be going ass to grass, you shouldn't be going ass to grass. Like what's your experience with that?
So there are certainly going to be some sport specific differences. In some sports, we maybe don't train full ass to the grass. Like there are some people that need the stiffness of squatting through a limited range of motion. But I'm betting most of the people listening to this are training for general physical fitness or aesthetics goals in mind. And so when it comes to general fitness, the research on full depth squats is pretty clear. Like full depth squats are safe. There's no increased risk by going to full depth. In fact, certain tissues are loaded significantly less when we go to full depth, like your kneecap. So if you're worried about knee pain in the squats, when we squat lower, we actually see less force on your knees than if we stop squatting at a 90-degree angle. When we look at MRIs of people's knees that have squatted to full depth for high amounts of volume, like we don't see any negative like wear and tear on those joints long-term from squatting to full depth. In fact, the opposite. We actually see that people that Olympic lifters that are high-level Olympic lifters tend to have better cartilage thickness long-term when they squat through full range of motion. From a performance standpoint for general fitness, some research on muscle hypertrophy has shown that we get better muscle hypertrophy in the legs when we squat full depth range of motion in terms of like adductors and glutes versus when we do just partial range of motion squats, we see less adductor and glute muscle hypertrophy compared to full depth. So I tend to want people to squat to the lowest depth that they can with good form. And I think that's where we're going to get the most hypertrophy benefits. I think from a strength standpoint, strength is more specific to the range of motion you train in. But what we'll see is people that do full depth squats tend to get much stronger at full depth than people that do partial depth. And they also gain partial depth squat weight. They don't gain as much as a group that solely focuses on partial range of motion squats because there's some specificity there, but they gain a good amount in those partial ranges of motion. So I'm part of full range of motion team. That's my belief. Go as low as you can through full range of motion. I think that's what our joints are designed to do. And I think that's what leads to our joints and muscles continually positively adapting to the stresses that we put on them. So I want to make sure we keep that stuff opened up and healthy for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And would you say, so when we're talking about like kind of coming down, into people coming down into the hole and then kind of bouncing back up, what's your experience with that? Because I know that I've seen that when people are trying to get, ass to grass, they kind of just drop down and then kind of try to bounce back up out of it. What's your your view on that side of things.
Yep. So it can certainly be great from a performance standpoint. Like if I'm trying to max out my squat and it's test day, or I'm trying to improve my 1 rep max clean, like I'm going to utilize that bounce and that stretch reflex to help me push a little bit more weight. But I'm a big fan in kind of varying our tempo during different periods of our training. So again, I'm mostly in the CrossFit space. So I see CrossFitters always working out for time. So they're always doing the bounce, whether that's during a Metcon or during their strength work. And I don't have a problem with that most of the time, but I think tendons tend to respond really well to heavy, slow loading. And so in CrossFit athletes, we tend to see more tendinopathies, tendon pain than anything else. And so I think a lot of times taking a period of time in our training, that could be like 1 month every quarter or 1 month every 6 months, and purposely slowing our tempo down through full range of motion is really valuable. So instead of dropping down as fast as we can and bouncing out of the hole, let's take 3 seconds to lower down as slow as we can. That's pause for a second at the bottom, and then that's explode up without having the bounce. So I'm much more of an and, not an or person. Let's realize that we get benefits out of both, and let's train both at different times.
Yeah, that makes sense. For someone who is primarily focused on say like hypertrophy, and they're squatting just for that goal, is there any use in the bouncing side of things, or probably more towards the focusing on the tempo?
Yeah, I'd probably be a little bit more focused on the tempo, but not always. So tempo and time under tension has been shown to be correlated with hypertrophy. So when we slow stuff down, we can possibly have a better muscle building effect in the human body. But one important factor long term in building muscle mass is progressively overloading those muscles. And so I think at times it's valuable in the bodybuilding world to use a little bit of body oomph, to like move your body and use a little bit of momentum when you lift to move a little bit more weight. While pro bodybuilders aren't always like the best example of what you should be doing as an individual athlete, if you go on YouTube and watch pro bodybuilders lift, you're going to see times where they do really slow controlled eccentrics. You'll see them do forced reps, things like that. But then you'll also see times where they're doing rows and things like that, where they're using their body and getting a lot of motion into it, because there's also value in that from a progressive overload standpoint. So it's and not or, more times than not. And it's as much as I wish everything was black and white, because that's the way my mind tends to work. There's a lot of gray in the world.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Cool. So kind of piggybacking off of muscle building and chatting a little bit about CrossFit as well. So this is kind of another question I wanted to ask you when it comes to CrossFit and muscle hypertrophy. There's a lot of people out there who say, like, if your goal is to build muscle, you should be doing CrossFit because it's not, specific to the goal. Can you chat a little bit about like why we see CrossFit athletes who are, super jacked and how that actually happens?
It's funny that so many people say that these days, because realistically, like if you walk into a Globo gym and you walk into a CrossFit gym and you look at a bunch of people working out, you're more likely going to say, most people would say that they actually want to look like the CrossFitter. That's got a little bit of muscle, but has a low body fat percentage and is overall just aesthetically looks pretty good. And I think that's what most human beings want to look like a little bit more than what we see in most Globo gyms. We build muscle hypertrophy through a couple different mechanisms, but two of them are lifting heavy loads creates muscle hypertrophy if we have enough nutrients on board, and metabolite buildup. So metabolite buildup is like the burn that you feel if you're doing like a high volume set of something. Like if you're doing bicep curls and you hit, rep 12 where your muscles are starting to get really fatigued, you feel the burn in the muscle. That's different metabolites building up in your muscle belly. In CrossFit, they lift heavy weights and they do a high volume of training where we're really fatigued, where we're creating a significant amount of muscle fatigue. So via those two mechanisms tends to be where CrossFitters get their hypertrophy effect from. Now, they don't do as much like time under tension work or that slow tempo stuff that we talked about a minute ago. So they kind of tend to miss out a little bit on that piece of the equation from a hypertrophy standpoint. But that's how you'll see people gain 20, 30 pounds of muscle when they go into a CrossFit gym, even though they're not following what we typically think of as traditional hypertrophy work, because those two mechanisms will still drive those effects.
Yeah. I think there's there's a lot of like misinformation and just not understanding like what is going on when it comes to like there's different kind of ways to build muscle. And I think one of the things too, I mean, at least for me, like I did CrossFit for a while and I kind of hit this wall. And until I started incorporating some more accessory things is when I started to see some more progression on the bodybuilding side of things. So is that something that you recommend, like when you're kind of missing out on maybe some accessory work, like would that be, obviously smart to start to incorporate, or is there anything specific that you personally do with your clients to help with more of those accessory movements that they might not be getting in a typical CrossFit workout?
Yeah, so my entire online business is built around that. So I partnered with a gymnastics coach named Pamela Gagnon, and we have 40 different programs that are all accessory-based programming to help you with certain goals. So if you're wanting to build your aerobic base or get your first muscle up or improve your mobility or improve hypertrophy, we have these short little programs that take 10 to 15 minutes, 3 to 4 days per week to complete, to add in just a little bit of volume on the specific areas that you need to bring up. And the key with that is it has to be a little bit of volume, because for most CrossFitters, they're already getting after it pretty intensely with strength work and metabolic conditioning work. And we can't just continually like bang our head into the wall by adding nonstop, hard, heavy training volume. So it has to be short little bites that don't really interfere with your recovery, but build just enough extra volume into your training that things start to get better. And I think there's a ton of value in that. What we have to be honest with ourselves about as CrossFit athletes, if we're going to do that, is we have to kind of look at what our programming and life looks like outside of training. Because if you go to CrossFit.com, for example, all of their workouts typically have one component. Like there's a strength piece or there's a conditioning piece. It's not let's go in and deadlift and then let's do Fran. They typically do one thing at a time. And many CrossFit gyms are kind of falling into the habit now of doing strength bias programming where there's always a strength or a skill movement, always conditioning. So they're already doing a ton of volume. If we then go throw more volume on top of it, sometimes that's more than what people can handle. Or if you've got a stressful job, if you're having a fight with your spouse, if you're not eating well, sleeping properly, adding training volume on top of that is not always the answer. But if you have a lot of those things in check, adding a little bit of volume can be exactly what you need to do to kind of bust through that plateau.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense. Would you say, and this is something that I fell into too back in the day, was like I would, go to CrossFit like 6 days a week and have like an active rest day, where I was like doing something else that was crazy and I just wasn't recovering. What for like your average person who is just maybe going to CrossFit, on a weekly basis, they're trying to get a good workout in, trying to potentially change your body composition a little bit. What would the ratio that you would recommend typically would be like? 3 days of CrossFit, 2 days of accessory work, or like what would the typical kind of breakdown of that be? Obviously, it's dependent on the person, but just in general.
My ideal situation is going to be, and according to the research, 3 to 6 days per week. So that's where we see the least amount of injuries happen. And I think if you're trying to improve your body composition, your strength, whatever fitness metric you want, the key to that is consistency of training. And so what's the biggest way to interrupt your consistency of training? Getting injured. So that's first, stay between that 3 and 6 that research has said in the CrossFit world is where the least amount of injuries happen. Then beyond that, it's going to be kind of individual. So I do really well with working out and CrossFitting 5 days a week. And then I do 1 day of just long, slow aerobic. Because long, slow aerobic doesn't take as much to recover from. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that it helps us from a recovery standpoint. And then I give myself 1 day of complete rest. I know other people that can do 3 or 4 days of heavy CrossFit in a week, and then they're done. Like that's all they can do from that high intensity standpoint. And maybe another day a week, they're doing yoga or heavy, slow stuff. To me, it's really individual. If you're a CrossFit athlete and you're trying to go 6 days per week, but you find yourself every Thursday waking up and saying, I'm going to skip the gym today, and that becomes a pattern, then I think you got to look back and think, maybe I'm pushing it too much or not recovering enough the first 3 days of the week. And maybe you need to adjust your schedule a little bit. But for me, it's 3 to 6 days per week. And then we have to kind of get individualized after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then obviously nutrition and sleep and stress all play into that. That's like a whole other podcast we could do. But yeah, that makes sense. I do. So it just popped into my head I just want to go back to what we were talking about before, about the limiting factors. Cause I do get this question a lot from different clients and people. Like, we talked about the wedges and the heel lifts for squatting or lunging or whatever it may be. In terms of using like a lifting belt, can we chat about that a little bit and when you would or would not recommend that?
Yeah, so a lifting belt in research has been repeatedly shown to help improve the amount of weight you can lift. So it essentially, when used correctly, it's just going to let you do a better job of creating stiffness in your spine so that your spine can support more weight and we can now overload your legs a little bit more. So I think if our goal is to build leg strength and tissue quality down there, using a weightlifting belt is a very valuable tool. It'll let us stiffen the spine up more, overload the legs more. I think the research shows, don't specifically quote me on this, I think it shows 3 to 5% more weight can be lifted with a weight belt. So I want to take advantage of that. Now, I don't wear a weight belt all of the time, but there are certainly going to be periods of time where I'm going to use it more than not. Like right now, I'm in a block of training where I'm not using a weightlifting belt at all on purpose, but I'm lifting a little bit higher volume or just general hypertrophy focused in my programming. And I'm going to be tapering that volume down and the load up. So as I get heavier and heavier, I'll be utilizing the belt more and more, just because under those heavier loads, I want to be able to create a stiffer spine. I don't have like specific percentages where I recommend people necessarily put it on or off. Like I'm not belting up for a 30% of my 1 rep max for sure. I'm certainly belting up somewhere when I get to reps below 8, I'm using it. But beyond that, like there are times where I'll be doing 5 sets of 10 at 50% of my 1 rep max, and I'll use a belt. There are times where I do the same and don't. It's an and not or thing, but it certainly is a good tool to use at times if you know how to properly brace your spine to begin with. So it's not like you don't put the belt on and cinch it down as tight as you can and use that to create stability. You put the belt on and it's sort of tight, and you actually breathe into your belly and kind of press into the belt, and that combination of stuff is essentially like carbonating a soda bottle. A carbonated soda bottle is stiffer than if you grab like just a water bottle. That carbonation, that pressurization of your abdominal cavity stiffens the spine, and a belt just helps you do an even better job of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think, as the loads get heavier, especially, it just kind of makes sense from a practical standpoint. Like, maybe, and the main thing that I took away when someone told me this was like, we're not necessarily meant to be putting like hundreds of pounds on our back, right? Like maybe we did evolve to try to do that, but like it's not like natural, I guess you could say. So like having that assistance and a little bit more to, train your brain to actually push out against something if you're wearing that belt, right? Like you said, it's not about just like putting the belt on and like trying to have the belt do the work for you. Like that's going to be a recipe for disaster. But actually being able to brace with that on. So you talked about the water bottle versus carbonation bottle as like something to think about when you're thinking about bracing for, going into a squat. Are there any other cues or anything that you found helpful for your clients when it comes to kind of teaching them how to brace properly within a squat or a deadlift or anything like that?
For me, that typically just starts with having them like laying on their back and take some deep belly breaths and focusing on like filling their abs with air. Like they're not actually filling their abs, but we'll see their stomach expand a little bit. And then I want them to tighten on top of that air. And that's typically how I end up beginning to teach somebody to do this. And then we'll take it up to their deadlift or their squat. But it is actually a naturally occurring movement. So if you look at research on people doing like manual labor, they kind of naturally do this, what's called a Valsalva maneuver, where you hold your breath, brace your spine. It naturally occurs. But like you said, we don't typically across, the lifespan of humans, we haven't traditionally put barbells on our backs. And so we do this Valsalva maneuver at kind of a lower level intensity than we see when we do like a 1 rep max back squat. So sometimes we have to take this naturally occurring movement and teach people to actually do it a little bit better when they're lifting maximal loads.
Yeah, for sure. I love how you put that. Makes sense. Cool. Another question I had in terms of some external mechanisms that we could potentially use to help us are using like grip strength versus using straps or like Versa grips or whatever it may be. What's your take on that? Because I know that this is something that I tend to get into a lot of arguments with my other friends and other coaches. Some of them are like totally against using grips or straps, and then I'm just my view is I like them and I think that they're useful, especially with the goal at hand. But I want to hear what you have to say.
I'm gonna sound like a broken record, Rachel, and not or. So it's what's our goal? Is our goal of the deadlift to overload the back and the hips and the hamstrings and the quads, or is our goal of the deadlift to train our grip? So I can deadlift 500 pounds. I can't do that without grips. So if my goal is to pull the maximal weight off the ground, then my training is going to use grips. Now, I also, being a CrossFitter, I not only deadlift, but I do the clean. We can't clean with grips on because we can't then translate that to the jerk. So I also need my grip to be strong enough to hold it clean. So when I deadlift, I don't use my grips until I get over 400 pounds to where I can no longer hold the weight without that little bit of assistance device. So I'm still getting grip work in, but then when I reach that capacity of what my grip can hold and I still want to overload my legs, then I throw grips on and get a little bit more training specific to improving back, hip, leg strength.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, makes sense. And not or. I think that is the definitely what I've taken away from this interview. And like you mentioned, nothing is really black or white. It's always kind of a gray area and depends, what your goal is, right? So I think that is for sure, like when you're thinking about whatever, these training devices that you're using or whatever external things that you're using or not using, it all comes back to, what that main goal is for you at that point in time. So love it. Awesome. Well, I feel like we covered a lot. Thank you so much for going into detail. Do you want to, I always end with I almost forgot. I always end with the question for my interviews, and it doesn't have to be related to nutrition or fitness or whatever it may be. It can be anything at all. And so the question is there anything within the past year that you've changed your mind about and why?
I haven't changed my mind on this, but I've been regularly reminded how important it is, and I wasn't doing it, tracking my nutritional intake. So even though I'm very familiar with the research on how much protein for somebody my size with the fitness goals I have in mind should be getting, I was not tracking that. And every time I would track it, when I wasn't regularly tracking, I would just be shocked that I was regularly 20, 30% under what my daily protein intake should be, under what my total caloric intake should have been. And the more I've tracked, the more that's just shown up as something that, like, gosh, how much performance stuff have I left on the table over the last few years because I was too lazy to take this one extra step to realize all the fitness stuff I should have done. I mean, I'm eating like 800 more calories per day right now than I was a couple months ago. It's beautiful. Like, you asked me before we started recording what I eat for breakfast. I have tater tots every day.
Yeah.
I love tater tots, and I get to eat tater tots every morning because I need the calories. And until I started tracking, I didn't realize how much I was under eating and robbing myself for performance. So tracking let me eat more. It's awesome. I thought it was going to make me eat less.
No, I love that. And that's something that just to kind of wrap up this interview, especially when it comes to performing and recovering at your best. If that is your main goal, like, you need to be eating enough. And if you're not measuring it or tracking it, like, how would you know? So that's something that I always, preach to my clients as well. A lot of people think that you just kind of track your food when it comes to fat loss or weight loss, but it's in the opposite direction. And for a lot of people, tracking to make sure they're eating enough is a huge, huge piece of it as well. So awesome. Love it. Well, do you want to tell our listeners or viewers, if they're watching this on YouTube, where they can find you? I know you have a ton of great content on Instagram. I've been following you for a while. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show. But do you want to tell them your website, social media, any programs or anything fun you have coming up?
So the social media is the Barbell Physio, but I tend to tell people go to the website instead. Social media is where you just see snapshots of stuff and you can't really dive into what you really need to understand at depth on social media. So my two main websites are thebarbellphysio.com and performanceplusprogramming.com, where we have like over 200 articles between those two sites and all these different topics that we talked about today. So should be some good info to dive a little deeper if you want.
Yeah, for sure. And I've gone into your blog posts and all of that in detail. They're great. So I will definitely link all those in the show notes for our listeners to check out. And this is great. I think we covered a bunch of common topics that I get questions about. So I'm excited for people to hear this one. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you want to end off on?
No, enjoyed it. Thank you, Rachel.
Cool. All right. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of MetFlex and Chill. I hope you enjoyed it. It would be awesome if you could give the show 5 stars and leave a review on iTunes. We're trying to get placed in the top 100 health podcasts, and the 5-star ratings and reviews are what can help make that happen. I'll add step-by-step directions for leaving a review in the show notes. I know it's a big ask, but it really helps. Thanks again. See you next time.